Hi, this is Swapnil Bhartiya, and we are here at GitLab Contribute in New Orleans. And today we have with us Ben Kochi. You are a staff backend engineer at GitLab. Let's start with your own journey, your own involvement with the cloud native world. So can you talk about that a bit?
I started my career as a systems engineer, and in 2005 I joined Google, and I really learned what it took to run humongous cloud services and all of the humongous things that you would have to do and the changes that you have to make to running systems at a cloud scale. And in 2013, I joined a small startup in Berlin, Germany, where they were starting to have some of the same challenges. And we were building out the idea of running our applications in containers. And in order to run the applications in containers, we needed to evolve the monitoring software to keep up with that growth and that amount of change in the network. So the containers are constantly being created and destroyed. Sometimes there's 10, sometimes there's 50, sometimes it goes up and down from 10 to 50 in a single day. So we needed a very dynamic monitoring system to keep up with that so that we could have the information we needed to provide the on-call engineers with the notification and the data in order to do performance tuning and be notified when there are problems. And the existing monitoring tools we had, like Nagios, couldn't keep up. There was a couple of other ex-Google software engineers at the startup, and we had seen this pattern before. So we had an idea in our head of what it took to do cloud native monitoring. And so they started the project to build a monitoring system, and that's where Prometheus was created.
What has been your involvement with Prometheus project? You did give us a background about how the project came into existence, but what is your involvement?
My involvement started a little bit later in the life cycle in the creation of Prometheus. My job was being an SRE, site reliability engineer, and so my needs were to have the system ready and working. But once we had a working production-ready Prometheus system, I joined the work to take all of the existing monitoring that we did have and port it over to Prometheus. So where we had applications, we had gaps in monitoring, I went and created the monitoring tools to be able to ingest that information. So working, we have a MySQL database, and we need to get the performance data out of MySQL into Prometheus. And we have kernel data that we need from Linux to get that into Prometheus, or random applications and working with the software developers working on their applications, be like, hey, we have this gap in monitoring of your application. Here's where we need to instrument it and add that instrumentation into the application.
What are the problems that Prometheus solves for its users?
From a site reliability engineering perspective, we need visibility. We need to know what's going on inside the application in real time and get this data and correlate it over time. It's not enough to just have the application running and seeing it once. You need to see the details of every transaction that goes through an application. And you can get some of that from the logs that the application produces, but there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of details in logs that you can't get because it's too much information. So we distill some of the data that we would normally get in logs into metrics. And so these metrics are our first layer of instrumentation and observability. So by counting how many times the application processed a request, how long it took, whether there was an error, how many database requests needed to happen, how long did the database request take, all of that information can be distilled into numeric metrics. In an application, we have service level objectives, and these objectives tell us where we want the performance of the application to be. And with metrics, we can use, we can calculate the service level objective, and we can see, are we meeting our objectives? And having that direct feedback is super valuable for the developers.
And is Prometheus a kind of silver bullet, or there are certain use cases where you should use it versus you should not use it?
That's a very good question. Observability, to me, is a multifaceted thing. Prometheus is very good at collecting metrics and collecting data, but that's just the start. After you've got the collection of the metric data, you also need to look at these logs. You need to look for outliers, and so there's a second layer. So once you have a metric that tells you that you're having a problem, then you have the logs, and that gives you another level of insight. And also, logs only tell you that view from one part of your application. You might also you want to have what's called tracing and distributed tracing to trace the application from requests from the front end through your application all the way back to your database, through your cache or whatever other components. If you have a microservice framework, you'll have very complicated interactions. So you need the tracing and the logs and the metrics in order to have the full observability stack.
How can someone who is GitLab user or customer, how can they use Prometheus in what scenarios?
Sure. So GitLab is one of the things that we're trying to build into it is the ability for this full DevOps lifecycle. And so once you've got your code, GitLab provides the CI/CD that lets you deploy the code to your production environment. And we want to add on top of that, we'll add monitoring. So GitLab will deploy Prometheus for you and build useful dashboards and useful feedback on your running application in a production environment. And that's the full step is, so once you have your application code deployed to production, and then Prometheus will monitor it and give you feedback and let you know if your application is doing what you expect it to.
We have been talking about Prometheus and GitLab, and let's just change the gears for a while and let's talk about
Sure.
one of the hottest technologies that everybody talks about, and I don't actually know who doesn't use it. That's Kubernetes. So first of all, let's quickly talk about the evolution of Kubernetes, because you have been in the field cloud native for such a long time. Can you give us a kind of quick overview of the evolution of Kubernetes?
Sure. So Kubernetes actually started at Google as a thing called Project Omega. And at Google, we had been doing containers since 2004 or so. And they wanted to evolve the existing container framework called Borg. And they had a bunch of ideas, and they were working on it internally to try and release a next generation Borg. And it turned out to be that building an entirely new system for inside Google was an extremely complicated project. So what they ended up doing is they took the ideas and the code from Omega and used that to refactor and build Borg without replacing Borg. But there's also this growing gap of Google's internal container and deployment system was so completely different than the outside world that they wanted to start to bring this idea of containers and dynamically deployed applications to the outside world, because it would help drive the adoption of the Google Cloud Platform and also like better train software engineers to work for Google. So that's where Kubernetes got its start. It was created as a way to teach the rest of the world how containers could be used to run a production environment. There were other container systems out there. Some of them were very primitive. Some of them were quite nice. But the goal was to be an experimentation platform and be possibly be an eventual replacement for Google's internal container platform.
And how does GitLab enable its user to consume or use Kubernetes?
With GitLab, whether you're a GitLab Enterprise on-prem customer or a GitLab.com SaaS user, you can take a Kubernetes cluster running in whichever cloud provider you want, or running even in your own on-prem system, and you can connect your projects. So you build a piece of code, you CI test it with GitLab runners, and then you can connect GitLab to your Kubernetes cluster with the API key, and then the CD system will deploy your code into a Kubernetes cluster and scale it up to whatever it needs to be. So you can now fully manage your running application from within GitLab.
So what kind of users are there who are using Kubernetes? I'm talking about GitLab users.
There are a lot of GitLab users in basically every industry out there, whether it's a car company or a bank or medical companies or universities or governments. GitLab users are everywhere, and so a lot of them want to deploy code in a cloud native application way. They're trying to get to the same kind of development practices that the startups are using, and also even startups would want to use these, fast development cycle, dynamic deployments, and ease the code into production. And GitLab can do that via Kubernetes deployment.
And when these customers do use Kubernetes, what are the problems or challenges they come across, and how do you help them?
Monitoring is a huge one, and security is another one. So what we're trying to do is you can create a application running in Kubernetes, but monitoring it can be extremely difficult. So we provide a push button deploy Prometheus to monitor the application, and Prometheus itself is an extremely powerful monitoring system, but it's also extremely complicated in terms of you need to understand the Prometheus query language, and because it is such a powerful monitoring system, the flood of information can be extremely overwhelming. So what we're trying to do as GitLab is we're trying to build a easier user interface and a better overall view of an application running in Kubernetes, that it simplifies the view. So for example, in Prometheus monitoring, we talk about the read method and the use method. It's the rate, the errors, and the duration is the three main things that users care about. They sent a request, there was how many errors were produced, and how long did it take. Because users don't care about your uptime or your availability. They care, they don't care about your database. They just want to be able to make a request, not get an error, and it come back fast. So this simplification is something we're trying to build into GitLab, so that it will provide a very simple front end for that information.
So this is the first GitLab Contribute event. What has been your experience so far?
I've been to several of the previous GitLab summits, and it's always good to be able to see coworkers and interact with them and have some time to face-to-face to talk about things that we want to work on together, and just being able to grab somebody and pull them over and this is the plan, and we're working on what is our 1-year plan and 2-year plan. Where do we want to see the platform grow for GitLab.com? Where do we need the code for GitLab, the product to be going? And just being able to have that interaction and build the team cohesion better, and bring the new people in, and teach them and meet them and introduce them to all the people who are working on it and contributing.
Excellent. Before we wrap this interview, I would like to know, what do you do in your free time? What are your hobbies? You live in Berlin, so there must be a lot of things to do.
Yeah, I love Berlin. Berlin is a great city. I spend a lot of my time cycling. I love to go out and just ride the countryside and see nature and spend time outside.
Awesome, Ben. Thank you so much for talking to me today. And I'll see you again in the next interview. Bye for now.
Thank you.